Welcome one and all to the Pension Research Council dinner. For those of you that hadn't heard this already, this is the 65th anniversary of the Pension Research Council Symposium and a year of life, a year of existence. So I hasten to add, I have not been head of the PRC for 65 years, even though I may feel like it some days. But it's really a great pleasure, and it's in fact an honor to have so many of you with us, so many of you having partnered with us year in and year out intellectually, helped us with our funding, helped us with giving us advice and direction, and I am very, very grateful for all that you do. I think that Wharton is on the map and the Pension Research Council is on the map for being the oldest, best research institution on pensions and retirement research in the world. So thank you all for being part of that. This evening we'll have some entertainment, and then we're going to have a keynote speech. The entertainment consists of the little slip of paper that's on your table. There's one for each, and a pen to fill it out. And every year we ask you to forecast a year ahead what you think the inflation rate, the treasury rate will be, GDP growth, and so forth. And we also have a couple questions for you to discuss. What's your economic outlook for the next year, and what are you doing differently than before given the economy? So that's what we'd like you to spend a few minutes on. While you do that, if you put your name on the top of the sheet, we won't embarrass you publicly if you're way off, but what we will do is reward you publicly if you're right on. So take a few minutes to fill out your sheets. We will be collecting them, and in the meanwhile, you will be reminding me of who won this year. And oh, one other thing, I was told by my best macroeconomic friend, Julia Coronado, that the first line where it says inflation rate should say headline CPI, just to be clear which inflation rate we mean. So just to help out there. All right, next I would like to announce the winner of last year's predictions. Drum roll. The winner of last year's prediction lottery, no, it wasn't a lottery, it was actually based on merit, was Pete Brady. Is Pete Brady here? Please come forward. There he is. The good man. Ask him his forward suggestions after dinner. So without further ado, please finish your salad. Dinner will be served, and we can take time to chat during that. When dessert is served, we will be very grateful to have our keynote speaker, Professor Atif Mian from Princeton, come to talk to us about debt and the Great Recession, his thoughts about where we went wrong and where we're going. So that's the timeline of tonight's events. Any questions? Dead silence. Thank you very much. Thank you to our worthy staff that have been keeping everything going so well. And without further ado, let me wish you a great dinner. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, let me thank you for your attention this evening and direct you to my colleague Kent Smetters, who's going to introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, Professor Atif Mian from Princeton. So Kent Smetters.
Not for me. So I'm pleased to introduce Atif Mian, who's the John Laporte class of 1967 professor, economics and public policy at Princeton. His book called House of Debt, How They and You Caused the Great Recession and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again. This book has received raved reviews from every possible source on the planet. You would thought it was like the last installment for a Harry Potter series or something like that. Larry Summers referred to it as the most important economics book of 2014. It could be the most important book to come out of the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent Great Recession, back when Larry thought that debt mattered. But no. Kidding. So Atif and his co-author, Amir Soufei, argued in the House of Debt that basically, again, you caused the Great Recession with your massive spending. And so and more importantly, that current public policy is biased toward debt and consumption and what we can do about it. So please join me in welcoming Atif.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Anna Marie and Olivia for the invitation. There's no flat surface here, so I have a glass of water. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to explain how I view the connection between finance and the macroeconomy. And when I think of finance, obviously the main component of finance is credit, or the flip side of it, which is debt. So I'll talk about the connection between finance and the macroeconomy first from a business cycle perspective, but then I'd like to end on a longer term sort of secular view of how I see the two connecting with each other. And as I do that, I'll try to emphasize that it's a two-way relationship. There are structural fundamentals, if you like, of the macroeconomy that influence the size of the financial sector. And then it's the financial sector and movements within the financial sector that affect the macroeconomy. And so I will start with the latter first, which is how fluctuations in the financial sector affect the macroeconomy, which is more the business cycle view. And then I'll end with what I was saying, the longer term view, which is what are the structural or fundamental factors within the macroeconomy that actually determine in the long run the size of the financial sector. And there's a common theme in connecting the business cycle with the long term, and I'll try to emphasize that as we go along. So that's the roadmap, if you like, and I'll try to do that in 20 minutes or so. So let me start with the business cycle view, and just to motivate that, this is a picture that in at least one way summarizes the Great Recession in the US. On the x-axis, you have growth in household debt before the crisis, 2002, 2007, and on the y-axis, you have a measure of the severity of the crisis, which is the increase in unemployment rate. That's it. There's no other smoothing, massaging of the data. And you can see a very strong, by macro standards, a very strong correlation and a very high R-squared between the two. What is equally surprising in my view is that obviously each dot here is a state within the US. So states that saw a larger growth in household credit, they also experienced a much stronger recession. What is interesting is that if you were to draw the same figure cross-country, exactly the same variables, the same time period, you essentially see exactly the same picture, not only in terms of the correlation, but also in terms of magnitude. Again, if you were to look at, these are roughly OECD economies around the world, countries that experienced a larger credit boom in the household sector, they also ended up experiencing a stronger bust or a stronger recession. Okay? Now, what I'm going to argue, first of all, is that this relationship between growth in credit, and in particular growth in credit in the household sector, and subsequent recession is much broader in the data. It's not just an artifact of the Great Recession. You might say, especially those of you who are into statistics, you say, I'm cheating here, ex post, I'm selecting on the recession. And it's not a huge surprise that if you condition on the recession, it's obviously those who borrowed more will suffer more, conditioning on the recession. However, as I'm going to argue next, this relationship also holds true unconditionally, which is to say, again, if you don't condition on the recession, you basically see very similar picture. And so that's my first point, which is connecting finance to the macroeconomy in the business cycle frequency. And the main point I want to put across is that this one thing that we have learned post the Great Recession on sort of the academic side or the intellectual side, if you like, is that this particular channel that was not given as much interest before as it really deserved is really important for explaining business cycle fluctuations. And I'm just going to refer to this channel as the credit-driven household demand channel. So how does this channel work? Well, this channel starts with, and I'm going to borrow from the language of kind of Kindleberger-Minsky, if you like, it starts from a disruption in the financial sector. And we think of that disruption as a local expansion in credit supply. For some reason, all else equal, people are more willing to lend, or there is greater credit availability. We have different theories of sort of why that might come about, but you can imagine that for one reason or another, global savings glut, deregulation, animal spirits, any one of those factors or all of those factors could come together and lead to an expansion in credit supply, greater availability of credit. And that leads to greater demand, household demand in the local economy. But that expansion in aggregate demand is short-lived. And at some level, this sort of finance-driven rise in demand sows the seeds of its own demise, if you like. And that's the third element of this hypothesis or this channel, which is that ultimately GDP slows down, growth slows down, and there is a recession or a contraction. These three elements, you can see very clearly that they happened before and then during and after the Great Recession, not only in the US, but also across the world. And in fact, as I said earlier, let me just quickly skip to that. This is not only true in this conditional sense, but this is true in an unconditional sense as well. So this is from work that I did with my co-authors, Emil Werner, who's now at MIT, and Amir Sufi, who's at Chicago. What we show in this paper is that using broader cross-country data, if you do, again, this unconditional analysis in sort of this VAR sense, if you like, what you see is that shocks to credit, they predict slowdowns. But what is interesting is not all shocks to credit are created equal. And what you're seeing in this figure is an asymmetry that I want to highlight. Expansions in credit, if you want to look at the impulse response function of growth in credit, you see an asymmetry. In particular, growth in household credit, again, the component or the piece that I highlighted in the very beginning, growth in that component of credit leads to this boom-bust cycle. And what is really strong in the data is the bust side, which is what I'm emphasizing here with the arrow, that acceleration in household credit, it tends to be followed systematically by slowdowns in aggregate GDP, which is what you can see here in this impulse response function. What is interesting is, again, this asymmetry that I was highlighting, which is that growth in non-financial corporate credit, which is the other component of private credit that I'm emphasizing here, that does not have any such relationship with the business cycle on average. Of course, we may have certain episodes in mind, but again, this is the average of sort of the major economies of the world, going as far back as we can, which is roughly speaking 1960s, 1970s. The question is why is this? Why does it happen this way? So we want to dig a little bit deeper into the micro foundations of this channel, if you like. And to answer that particular question, first, let me try to answer another important question here, which is all of this VAR stuff is fine, but can we get a little bit more causal evidence? If you like, we want to exogenously expand credit in certain local macroeconomies more than others. So we want to run, as you all know, some kind of a natural experiment to shock credit, unlike here where we are doing the more traditional kind of decomposition to construct these shocks. So to construct that experiment, and I'll talk about this in the context of that experiment, what I'm going to show you is, again, one case study, if you like, But this case study also shows up in the data more broadly in the sense of these broader patterns, some of which I've already shown you. But the story that I'm going to now tell through this case study again applies more broadly. For now, you just have to take my word for it because I only have 20 minutes. But let me give you this case study in a little bit more detail. The case study that I'm going to talk about is, again, for those of you especially who are in the banking finance literature, all of you know very well, it's the famous deregulation phase of US banking sector, when during the 80s, different states started deregulating their banking systems, but at different pace. So the deregulation was staggered, over the 80s essentially. This natural experiment has been discussed and exploited before, famous work by, seminal work by Phil Strahan and others. It's the same experiment that we are using, but we are using it in a slightly different way. We are using it to understand macro cycles, as opposed to sort of the more diff and diff, local average, treatment effect kind of analysis that has been done in this literature before. And in particular, I want to first show you the first stage. You want to know that. So what I'm showing you here is I'm basically going to do the most simplest version of this case study, which is I'm going to split US states into two groups, equal number of states, the early deregulating states and the late deregulating states. And this one is just showing you the first stage. Total credit expanded at a much faster pace and earlier in the early deregulating states as opposed to in the late deregulating states. So that's the first stage. We know the reason for the shock to credit, which is this deregulation. And this literature has already tried to argue that this is sort of exogenous from the perspective of forecasting business cycles. So let's take that exclusion restriction as given. What do we see in this? I want to understand what happens to the macro cycle in this natural experiment. Again, the famous one that all of us know very well. And the interesting thing is that, first of all, you do see a boom and bust cycle. And here you are seeing that boom and bust cycle through unemployment. In the early deregulating states, which remember are the blue states, you see a sharper fall in unemployment, or a bigger boom, if you like. But then the recession of 1991 kicks in, and the same states suffered a much deeper recession. So again, you see that boom and bust cycle driven by credit this time. And now the key advantage of this case study is that we can view this boom bust from as a causal mechanism driven by credit itself. Now the interesting thing is, now I'm going to get a little bit more into the channel of why we get this boom and bust cycle. The channel, as the three components I highlighted earlier, says that it's really a channel that is driven from the demand side as opposed to the supply side. And that is very important to understand why one kind of credit leads to this boom-bust cycle and the other kind of credit does not. Broadly speaking, of course, there are two sides of the economy: the demand side, where the households primarily sit, and the supply side, where the production of goods lies, which is where firms largely sit. And one type of credit is household credit, which fundamentally or more likely is influencing the aggregate demand side. So it's going to shift out aggregate demand more than the aggregate supply. And the other kind of credit, which is non-financial firm credit, it's largely going to affect the supply side. It's going to shift out the aggregate supply side by loosening constraints on that margin. What we see more broadly in the data, just through correlations that I showed you earlier, is this asymmetry, that credit that tends to expand the aggregate supply side, it may expand the aggregate supply side, but it doesn't seem to have any negative ultimate effect attached to it. In particular, it doesn't predict that bust that is so prominent for the other dimension of credit. And so we really need to think about theories that have that feature, that when credit shifts the demand side, that's when it's more dangerous, so to speak, from a business cycle perspective. When credit shifts the supply side, it's not as dangerous. We need to worry less about it. And so that's the first kind of key conceptual idea I want to implant in your head, and then I'm going to go somewhere with it, which is, in the long run, I'm going to come back to this demand side, this relationship between, love-hate relationship between credit and the demand side. But here you can see, we have already seen that it leads to these much deeper recessions in these early deregulating states. Let me now show you evidence that it's really because expansion in credit in this particular episode was shifting aggregate demand rather than aggregate supply. So how do you tease that apart? How do you identify that? Well, the key insight I'm going to exploit, this is something we have used in our other work as well, is the following. If there is an expansion on the aggregate demand side, then two variables should move together, which will not move in the same direction if it's the supply side that is being pushed out. What are those two variables? Well, think of the non-tradable sector. An expansion in aggregate demand will put more pressure on the non-tradable sector because, by definition, if overall demand is increasing locally, they can buy the tradable sector from the rest of the world, but the non-tradable demand must, by definition, must be satisfied by the local economy itself. So that means that the economy must shift towards the non-tradable sector relatively more than the control groups, or than the control local economies. Is that clear? So that's the basic test. Now, the economy shifting relatively more in the non-tradable direction because of this aggregate demand push is going to have two implications. Those are the two predictions that I'm going to test jointly. One is that the quantity of the will shift towards non-tradable, which is the share of employment devoted to the non-tradable will expand. And the other prediction is on the price margin. The relative price, for exactly the same reason as the employment is shifting towards a non-tradable sector, the relative price of the non-tradable sector will also increase. For those of you who studied small open economies, it's like saying real exchange rate will appreciate. In this monetary union we call the United States of America. So let's test for that. And now we are going to test for that by, again, looking at those states, but looking at non-tradable and tradable sectors differently. The prediction of the same theory is that this effect will only show up in the non-tradable sector. We will not see this effect in the tradable sector. So here I'm showing you the non-tradable effect on employment. The more shocked, remember previously I was just showing you treatment and control in two bins. This is the continuous version of exposure variable, the same exposure variable. And more exposed states, those are the early deregulated states, they are right here. So you see Maine and others right here. And we can see this relative expansion in non-tradable sector during the boom phase, exactly as you would expect under this hypothesis that it's pushing on the aggregate demand margin more than the aggregate supply margin. And you see the same, you don't see anything of that sort in the tradable sector. There is no relative expansion in the tradable sector, actually. All the expansion, that's another way of summarizing, the expansion that we were talking about, the boom that we were talking about, it was all concentrated in the non-tradable sector. And the key thing to keep in mind is that that's troubling. And again, for those of you who do open economy macro, we have seen this story before. This is like the sudden stop. Credit boom, large expansion, non-tradable sector, followed by a crisis, a sudden stop. And that's what we are seeing locally within the US as a result of these credit booms in this particular experiment. This is the price effect, non-tradable price goes up, and this is the real exchange rate appreciation effect that I was talking about. You obviously don't see any of that sort in the tradable price because that's determined by one common price. This is where we end up. This is exactly the same picture I showed you in the very beginning. In the very beginning, I showed you this relationship between, on the x-axis, we had growth in household leverage during the boom phase, if you like, and on the y-axis is the severity of the recession. The exact relationship that I showed you for the Great Recession, both within the US and across countries, almost exactly the same relationship holds true in this particular case study as well. The additional advantage I have is that now I can say more forcefully, I did not condition on the recession. I'm conditioning on the experiment, which is the banking deregulation, right? So I can instrument the x-axis if you like. I'm not doing that here, but I can instrument the x-axis with the instrument, which is banking deregulation, and the relationship continues to hold, right? But this is just, again, this picture again summarizes this key fact, business cycle fact in the modern economy, that fluctuations in business cycles, this relationship between credit is really driven by household credit, and it's affecting the macroeconomy through aggregate demand, by pushing aggregate demand up, which then leads to a collapse. Okay. The question now is, this kind of evidence, as I said, it's really kind of come about post-2008. It has really started or reinvigorated, if you like, a bunch of theoretical work in macroeconomics. that has really tried to understand how we can rationalize this. Why is this kind of credit so destructive? And equally importantly, why does it show up predictably in the data? And so this kind of work has relied on, for example, or has identified certain externalities, like aggregate demand externalities or pecuniary externalities, that people don't internalize when they're making their private borrowing decisions of how much to borrow once credit conditions loosen up. And so they don't take those macro externalities into account, and that's why you end up in a recessionary phase. So that's one way of thinking about these boom-bust cycles. Another way is by introducing behavioral stories into this equation, and to say, look, when credit gets loosened, people may not have the same beliefs. You have a world with heterogeneous beliefs, and it's the relative optimist who over binge on credit and ultimately lead to this sort of downturn in the economy that everyone suffers from. Skip that. So that's now this theoretical work that I'm talking about, it relies a lot on this important concept of heterogeneity in the economy, and in particular when I say heterogeneity on one key dimension, which is heterogeneity in how different people respond to income shocks, wealth shocks, or credit shocks. It kind of goes in the same direction for all of these shocks, which is that some people have much higher MPCs than others in response to these shocks. So when you expand credit, for example, a certain subsection of the economy is going to be very sensitive to that. It's going to borrow a lot against that, and others are not going to be very sensitive to that. Moreover, this relative sensitivity, it tends to sort on income and wealth as well. So the relatively poorer are relatively also more sensitive to these shocks than others. Now this has very important implications and partly explains the boom and bust cycle as well. Because the same people who are very reactive on the upside, on the downside, when they cut back, you want someone else to respond, to take their place. Right? Because when the same people who were expanding on aggregate demand, on the downside, they're going to contract on aggregate demand. To keep aggregate demand constant, you want someone else to pick up the slack from these high MPC individuals. But that's where you get in trouble. Because the other section of the population is actually not very sensitive to other instruments that you can use to try to convince them to consume, instruments like the interest rate. And so that's when the economy really gets into trouble and you get into stuff like the zero lower bound or a liquidity trap. Right? But that's, again, more of the theoretical foundations of this key channel that I just described to you. What I want to move towards next in the last 5 minutes or so is I want to move now towards the long term. Right? In the short term, again, the business cycle frequency is the demand side is really important for understanding this connection between credit and the macroeconomy. I want to now think a little bit more about the long term. At the business cycle frequency, as I mentioned, it's really the credit supply that kickstarts the process. The interesting thing is, if you look at the longer term, there's something similar going on. In other words, there is a similar super cycle in the economy that we all seem to be going through. And now I'm going to show you that super cycle. So what's that super cycle? So I'm just showing this for the US, but actually the global economy looks very similar. If you look at total credit to GDP, and so total credit, again, it has three main components: household credit, non-financial corporate credit, and the third one is government or sovereign credit. Now, sovereign credit is also very important because when you think about demand, so far I've only talked about private demand through private credit. But in principle, there is a substitute, and we saw that post-2008. When private credit pulls back and private demand falls as a result of it, you can still generate more demand by switching over to government debt and financing government spending through public debt. So both public and private debt can fund demand theoretically, and so that's why they are somewhat substitutable, and that's important to keep in mind. In any event, what I want to first show you is that there has been this massive expansion in total credit to GDP in the post-World War era, starting with 1980. It's kind of flat. In 1980, you see this boom in total credit to GDP. And the first point is that you see this boom the world over. It's not just a US phenomena. Number two, this boom is primarily explained by the boom in credit that is funding or financing, if you like, the demand side, which is private household credit and government credit. Non-financial firm credit does not explain this huge rise to the same magnitude. So these are the two components. The sum of this makes up this chart. The other fact that I think is extremely important to keep in mind to think of the long run is, I just showed you the quantity of credit, which is roughly doubling as a share of GDP. The other related fact is that the long-term interest rate, which is the price of credit, has been falling from 1980 onwards. It's essentially the other side of the same coin. You cannot sustain such higher levels of total credit without the interest rate falling. And so another way of saying that is, again, if you think of supply and demand 101, if quantity is expanding and price is falling, suggests only one thing. Supply curve has been shifting outwards. So this basic fact is telling us, and that's why I was calling it the super cycle, that there is a super cycle where total credit globally has been expanding. And it's a result of that super cycle that we have been seeing this more and more credit dependence of the economy. And as that process unfolds, we have these wiggles, which are the business cycles that I just talked about. But let's focus on this long-term trend. What's driving this long-term trend? I think this is one of the fundamental questions. I don't have specific answers for you, but we can speculate a little bit. One reason for this could be this demographics. That's obviously important. But other than that, there's also a more cyclical force, if you like, again, cyclical in the longer term, the super cycle sense of the word, which is inequality. And so if you look at the rise in household credit, for example, in the US, you can see that almost all of the rise in household credit, normalized by income, is explained by the bottom 99%. There is no effective rise in household credit to GDP in the top 1% of the population. So that suggests already why we are seeing this expansion in global credit to GDP. One factor could be this rising inequality, especially rising in share of income going to the top 1%. Why? Again, go back to the heterogeneity in MPCs that I talked about. We know that the top 1% have much higher propensities to save or much lower propensities to consume. So as they are getting a larger and larger share of the income, they are going to plow more and more of the financial flows into the financial sector to try to lend somewhere. And that's going to expand the size of the financial sector. That's basically what total credit means. So that's one possible explanation for why credit has been expanding. I just want to end on one note, which is, should we be worried about this or not? There are two ways to think about this. One is the obvious one. So let me just quickly say that and skip and then move forward. Which is, this process is only sustainable for interest rates getting lower and lower. But at some point, this process cannot continue, at least cannot continue without other kind of disadvantages or costs. And that is that as interest rates close to zero, the financial situation becomes very fragile and the environment becomes a lot more uncertain financially. And the zero lower bound, of course, is another obvious reason. I just want to end on one final thought, which is coming from this new work that I have, again, thinking about these issues with Amir Sufi and a colleague of mine at Princeton, Ernest Liu. And here, the point I want to leave you with is that so far, everything I've talked about is coming from the demand side, which is, if you think of rise in inequality, and if you want to think of long-run growth model, so that's long-run growth is on the y-axis, and the interest rate, long-run interest rate, think of the 10-year rate is on the x-axis. This is the traditional Euler equation that we all know. And this is the supply side. I'll just come back to the supply side in a minute. But when we talk about rising inequality, that's as if this Euler equation or demand curve is shifting inwards. And that can be the explanation for the fall in interest rate. That's what I was just talking about. What I want to think about next is, when that happens, what do our standard models suggest should happen? The standard models say the following, which is that the supply side is expansionary as interest rates decline. For any given future cash flow, as I reduce interest rates, I want to invest more. And so that's why lower interest rates are expansionary for the supply side. That's the very usual, typical argument, and it's hard to argue against it. But if that was the only game in town, then this reduced interest rate should have an enormous expansionary effect on the economy. But we don't see that. Along with this rising inequality, we have actually seen stagnating productivity growth, especially over the last 15 years or so. And the last thought I want to leave you with is that these low interest rates can endogenously lead to that low productivity growth. And the reason for that is, and this is what we show in that paper, that there is a second force that kicks in, which is that low interest rates are not good for competition. I don't have time to go into the reason, but there is the second force that kicks in, that at very low interest rates, the industry structure becomes a lot less competitive. It becomes a lot more concentrated. And again, we have a lot of evidence for that. As a result of that rise in market concentration, growth becomes contractionary. And the second effect starts to dominate. We show theoretically it must dominate as interest rate goes to zero. What that means for this more traditional supply side is that supply side that is downward sloping in general because of that traditional effect actually backward bends as the market structure becomes more concentrated and productivity growth slows down as a result of that. And if we are indeed living in that world, then this is quite troubling. Because as interest rates decline, not only is the economy not expanding, but in fact, it slows down endogenously. And notice, this is not a Keynesian model. There's no price rigidity or wage rigidity here, which means you can stay here for as long as the economy likes. So on that optimistic tone, I'll close and open up for questions.
All right, that was fantastic, even if a little gloomy to end on. Well, take questions. We'll go for like maybe 15 minutes or so, and why don't you state your name and a question, and we'll turn it over.
Hi, I'm Brett. Is this going? Yeah, it's going. Brett Hammond from Capital Group. So this is really interesting, and thank you so much. What I kept thinking about was intangibles. So there's a whole school of thinking about intangibles and why capital investment is so low, compared to what it might be if we were not in an intangible world. I bet you've thought about that. So can you tell us a little bit about how you think intangibles are affecting or not affecting your model? I said infecting.
Right. So in intangibles, to the degree we can, people try to accommodate for that. So that's intellectual property, and that's priced, and that's valued. So that's part of capital. But even accounting for that, as you suggested, investment has not gone up. In fact, it has slightly drifted downwards. One explanation for that is, and Larry Summers has talked about this a lot more in his secular stagnation kind of hypothesis, is that just the technology now doesn't need as much capital, right?
But why would could that affect what you're talking about?
So it goes in the same direction. The effect that I'm talking about acts as a multiplier on top of that. That's basically saying, look, the economy just doesn't need as much capital to produce the same stuff that it used to produce before. Now, if that is true, what that means is we don't need as much savings. So remember, the original problem, the original sin in the super cycle is that these gross savings are expanding at a much faster pace than before. If you combine that original sin with this technological update, that you don't need as much investment as before, real investment as before, the problem just compounds on itself.
So that would be still considered, so we know the capital share has increased quite a bit over time, at least in standard production. Would that still be consistent with that, or?
So what we know about, that's a different capital. That's the share of income going to non-labor factors.
Right.
What is relevant here is capital formation.
Okay.
So that's investment, real investment to GDP. That has not gone up. Because you need real deficit in the economy to absorb these surpluses, these financial surpluses. And they can naturally be absorbed by investment, real investment, but that has not gone up.
So, other questions? Yes, over there.
Hi. A quick question. I was just wondering, looking at this, have you thought about how this, you said this is, you're describing the United States, but you're also describing what's going on in the world in general. Japan in particular, do you have any observations?
Yeah, I think Japan kind of follows this story naturally. This started much earlier in terms of going through these dynamics. Again, an economy that became more and more reliant on credit, if you like, to generate demand. Interest rates became close to zero much earlier than in the rest of the world. So it's a story which is very similar. And one thing to keep in mind in terms of these Asian economies is what really matters here is, I told the story in terms of inequality, but it's not necessary for inequality to rise for the story to kick in. What is really fundamental is this desire to save. That's the real problem here. And so there is too much saving in the economy. That's the real problem. And again, when you think of it from that perspective, Japan makes a lot of sense.
Hold on, wait, one here, wait for the microphone, and again, if you could say your name.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Julia Coronado. So, and how directly do you tie that excess saving to aging?
I actually haven't done that
Because
myself.
this phenomenon empirically seems
Yeah.
quite linked to aging populations.
Right. That's what I was saying. Briefly, I mentioned the demographics is one
Right.
possible explanation
I'm
for
trying
that,
to
and
understand
that goes
the
in the
channel
same.
for that.
That goes in the same direction.
Right.
I haven't looked at it myself empirically. I'm currently sort of investigating the inequality side a bit more, but that certainly goes in the same direction. The bottom line is actually extremely straightforward and simple, which is for a total economy, if for whatever reason, whether it's inequality or aging or just culture, if you want to call it, that people like to save more, if it's saving too much, it's a problem. Because you can absorb savings in investment to some extent, but beyond that, the only way to keep the economy at the same equilibrium without going into what we typically call the liquidity trap is for the excess savings to go back into demand through someone borrowing for consumption. Could be private or could be public. But that process is, you can run it for a few years, but it's ultimately unsustainable in the long run. And that's what I'm highlighting. In the long run, it becomes a problem.
The other force that I think about in the global context is the growth model was not a market model. It was a highly managed model in Asia that generated excess savings in a command economy framework.
Yes.
So do you see that as?
Exactly. So again, as I said, the sufficient statistic is about excess savings. What could drive it could be inequality, could be demographic, could be something else. So China is one example where I think the institutional features are responsive. So here's my quick model of China. Quick model of China is it's a very command-centered economy, as you said. A lot of the earnings are controlled by the state, either directly through state-owned enterprises or indirectly. Ideally, it's a corporate governance problem. If you have state-owned corporations having a lot of earnings, it should go back to the people as dividends. But China does not do that. It doesn't. So Norway is a country that does that. It also generates huge public earnings, but it pays that back to its citizens through sovereign wealth fund that literally funds people's pensions. China does not do that. So private citizens in China do not regard all of this surplus as their own savings, which Norwegians do. And so as a result, they save for themselves separately. So my toy model of China is it's a country that's saving twice. The people saving for themselves, and then the government saving, nobody knows for whom, but they're saving. And so they have huge savings, but there's a problem, which led to the global savings glut. In the international context, China can afford to do that as long as US homeowners are happy borrowing and consuming their goods. But obviously that ended in 2008. And then interestingly, what we see post-2008 is that China, that never saw a domestic credit boom, now goes through a massive domestic credit boom. And my point is that's endogenous. That's exactly the point, that the only way to channel these surplus, if you cannot throw them out externally, the only other way to absorb them domestically is through growth of domestic credit, which is exactly where China is today.
All right, so you have to give up the microphone.
Sorry, I can go at this all night.
Karaoke night. Bob, why don't you?
Just looking at the demand side, so you define on one of your charts demand as including government and households. So how do you think of the expansion of government deficits, maybe modern monetary theory? I mean, so
I don't know what modern monetary theory is, so I
just
can't
that
talk about that.
You can
But
create unlimited. You can create unlimited.
nobody
debt.
has actually defined it, so I don't think it's a well-defined
Well, let's
concept.
say the idea that you can expand easily lots of government deficits. Let's just use that term.
Right. I think it's very, as I said, in this framework, it's very easy to understand the rise in sovereign debt. In fact, I think it was McKinsey that had a nice sort of this report early on, which I guess they've now updated, where they basically show there is no deleveraging post 2008, right? That's very obvious. If you think of the U.S., for example, obviously there's been a lot of deleveraging on the household side, but that's why I like to think of total credit, right? Because it's substitutable. All you need to do is you need to fund demand. You can either fund it through private sector or you can fund it through public sector. But if you don't, then the economy will start contracting. And so that is what motivates this push to run fiscal stimuluses and so on, which all the countries around the world have been running. And there are examples where the countries say, no, we want to be fiscally responsive, and then the economy starts to contract. And then they can't, so then they restart again. And again, the point of this is that you're stuck in that rut. But you cannot do that forever. Theoretically, you can, because you can say interest rates goes to zero and you can re-roll over everything, right? But practically it's a problem. And in fact, even theoretically, it's a problem if you believe in this backward bending supply curve.
Why do you say practically?
Because
Because you keep driving your potential.
because bubbles, financial bubbles, that nothing is priced properly at zero interest rate. So you can get huge fluctuations in prices. You can rationalize any price basically. So you can get large price fluctuations, and in the presence of debt, that leads to high fragility. That's just one reason.
Yeah, I thought your answer. Yeah, but I mean, if we're in a simple world of Samuelson, this is the Ponzi game that could work world. But in an endogenous growth model is what you're saying. You
If for any
correct.
reason risk premium rise, so that's what I mean.
Yeah.
If for any animal spiritual risk premium rise, a country elects someone who should not never be elected, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does seem a lot of people look at the government interest rate and not thinking about, we have lots of interest rates, including marginal product and capital, obviously, is much higher. We can't think about dynamic efficiency based on a single rate. Other questions? Yeah.
Ken, Steve Utkus, Vanguard. How does this relate to the sort of Robert Gordon argument about a permanent reduction in the productivity-enhancing opportunities available to industrial economies?
It doesn't. I mean, I think it's not. It's like an independent thing I'm talking about. Robert Gordon's point, as I understand at least, is that technologically we are just slowing down, and that's just the nature. We better get used to it, kind of a thing. If that's happening, that's fine. All these forces are still going to be operative, right? So everything I said is still relevant. It's just that our first best growth rate is lower than what we have been used to. But all of these forces are still relevant, and we still need to deal with them because they are still adding on top of that headwind that Robert Gordon talks about.
Okay, we'll take one.
So I guess I just want to push a little harder on what you were saying before about fiscal policy. Can you, if you were to design optimal fiscal policy at this point, long-run optimal fiscal policy, what would it look like?
Okay, good question.
You want to? I mean, yeah.
No, I think it's a great question, right? So fiscal policy, there are two ways of thinking about fiscal policy: the taxation side versus the spending side. One way is that you just spend more, you run perpetual deficits to try to get but as I said, that's a problem. You can't get. The other way is the original sin that I talked about. To the extent, and I don't want to say that's the only reason, so I want to caution against that, but to the extent it's the inequality piece that's driving this shift in Euler equation that I was referring to. What you can do is you can obviously tax and redistribute. But on that, it's actually interesting that not all taxes are created equal in that world. So my ideal, now don't quote me on that, I don't want to deal with politics. But you don't want to tax income necessarily too heavily, because income is distortionary, exactly. You want income to be even more progressive. So for example, people under 50, 60, whatever the right number is, $1,000 a year should not be paying any taxes, including payroll and anything like that. So you make it a lot more progressive. But you don't necessarily need to raise the top to 90% or something like that. But you can make it more progressive. That's number one. And number two, the crux of the problem is wealth tax actually looks a lot more attractive in this world, because that's the excess savings, right? Those excess gross savings is the real problem. And so wealth tax actually naturally falls out of this framework. Sorry, but that's just theoretically that's what happens.
If you can grab it. Any last questions? All right. Yeah, it's someone with wealth.
Who invited him?
Please speak up. Someone with some money here. Again, please start with your name.
Surya Kalori, one quick question. So since 2009, we've been in 10 years of expansion, at least in the US, and we know interest rates have been low. I can't speak to credit, so I would love to hear your comment on this, the credit cycle the credit growth that you've been showing in your curve, has it continued along with low interest rates here? Part A, that's a factual question. And then B, not that I'm asking you to predict, but based on your work that you've seen, is this about to turn away from expansion?
I will do very poorly on that prediction questionnaire that we were given. So yeah, I mean, again, globally, as I said, this expansion, we have seen overall rise in credit, continuous rise in credit globally. It doesn't have to happen in the US, it can happen globally, and so China has been, so for example, the external trade, if you look at China, for example, they contracted the external surplus quite substantially, partly by boosting credit internally, which meant the rest of the world did not have to increase credit at the same rate that it used to. So, so you want to look at all I'm saying is you want to look at total global credit in that framework. And again, you see continuous rise in global credit in this economy. While this expansion has been expansionary, of course, by the usual definition of the term, what is interesting in this expansion is, and that's why I was referring to productivity growth, that productivity growth has really been lackluster. So growth, if you had projected the same productivity growth as early 2000s, for example, GDP should have grown much faster given where unemployment is today. So really, this growth is kind of boring growth, or it's boring expansion, because it's combined with much lower productivity growth than what we have traditionally experienced. And that's that's problem. That's along with, of course, the fact that it's quite unequal, and that's giving rise to all of this political kind of tensions of polarization that we see. In terms of your predictions, I don't have specific predictions. What I can say is that what I do worry about is that because we are really not addressing the original sin, which is, again, we want a more balanced growth process around the world globally, and that, not much has been done to address that. Then what you really need to focus on is that are there disruptions in the financial sector that will make it harder and harder for the economy to kind of expand the way it has been expanding even over the last 10 years. And from that perspective, I do see certain signs that are worrisome. So you want to look at forces that are pushing back on credit growth. So that essentially, it's like these slowdowns and downturns in housing markets that we are seeing in Canada, in Australia, in China. I think if or when that process accelerates, the global economy will find it much harder to kind of move along at the pace that it has been moving along, particularly if China slows down. Because China at this point is an economy, obviously globally relevant, but it's also an economy that is a lot credit dependent itself. And the only good news there is that it's never going to have a Lehman crisis, right? Because the government is going to backstop everything, for sure. It's going to backstop everything, right? So things are going to have, it's like, next time you're going to die through slow bleeding as opposed to, a massive gushing wound kind of a thing. But anyways, I mean,
Gushing wound is a great place to stop. No, that was fantastic. Thanks, Sati.
Thank you.
And we have a little present for you. I don't know what it is, but it's heavy, so it must not be a prepaid credit card, since that would be really, really bad. So thank you
very much. Thank you very much.
Presentation, great questions, and wonderful evening. With that, I think we'll bring to a close our very busy day. We start again tomorrow. I hope most of you can be here with us. Thank you all for coming, and don't dream about gushing wounds, please. Thanks a lot. See you soon.